Okay, good morning. I wanted to get some hopefully very brief feedback for Module 4. We're halfway through the semester, so I think it's a really good time to give some basic feedback. First thing I want to mention overall is the big concept of Module 4, which was biodiversity. So before I even bring that up, let's back it up another step and think about the big concept to this entire course, right? The whole thing, if we're talking about environmental biology, is sustainability, right? All that we're talking about, that's basically what it boils down to, is are the things we're doing sustainable? The decisions we're making sustainable? And remember, sustainability is like basically, can we keep doing this? So it literally is a matter of life and death. Now, whether we're talking about something extremely pressing, like the Denora fog incident where they were pumping out things that was literally killing them right away, obviously that's not sustainable. Or if we're talking about something that might be taking a little bit longer, like climate change or overpopulation. Anyway, the point is, that's the big picture, right? We're looking at sustainability. Are things sustainable? And a big component of that is biodiversity. And you've already read about it, so I'm not going to say too much, but in a nutshell, for ecosystems to work properly, which is what we need for sustainability, they need diversity, right? And by diversity, I mean, again, you've read this already, but I'm talking about the different species, for example. Just think about all the different plant species as one example, and think about all the different conditions in a particular ecosystem. I'm going to look out my window right here, and I see, trees, and I see a hill, and I see an open field. So there's a lot of different conditions, even just in this one spot here in West Virginia. So think about all these different plants and all the different conditions that they might thrive in. So when it gets a little bit cold, there's some plants out there that are really going to thrive. When it gets a little bit too warm, there's different plants out there that are really going to thrive. When we get a little bit too much rain, there's a different set of plants that are going to thrive. And then when it's a little bit too dry, a different set of plants, right? Same thing with the pH of the soil, or the kind of the soil, or the particular pollinators in the area, right? As things change, as they do in the world, it's good to have a diversity, right? And I'm using plants still as examples. It's good to have all these different plants so they can take advantage of all these different situations and do their job, right? So that the ecosystem can be productive. And again, that's just the plants. Then you have to think about all the things that rely on those plants, those producers. And hopefully you're very familiar with that too after last week when we're talking about food chains and food webs. So yeah, the idea here for biodiversity is we need a bunch of different species. And again, it's not just the species, it's also like genetic diversity. For example, COVID has been deadly for some people. For other people, they didn't even know they had it. And there's probably a lot to it, but there's also probably a genetic component. So that's the idea of genetic diversity. You might, if we're looking at just one species as opposed to a bunch of species, like I just mentioned earlier, it's good to have genetic diversity, because otherwise, if there's a pathogen or a disease that could kill one person and there's not a lot of genetic diversity, then, well, you might be able to wipe out nearly everybody. So yeah. And then, of course, sorry, one more thing, looking at it at a higher level. So we started at species, and then we got a little bit more, we zoomed in and looked at genetic diversity. Then if you zoom out, then there's just the idea of having a bunch of different ecosystems, right? So the more ecosystems you have, the better the world is in responding to change. And again, that's what we need for sustainability. So biodiversity is so important. So anyway, I wanted to say that because that's the big take-home message from Module 2, right? You need to know, and I'm not even talking about grading or the exam, but just for the purposes of this course, for what I want you to know, biodiversity is so important. It's not just about, again, I use this term tree hugger. This isn't just about people say, oh, I love, don't tear down that tree. It's been here for 300 years and it has intrinsic value. And that might be true, but it's not just that, right? It's every living thing, every living species they're a piece of the puzzle, right? And the more we take away pieces of the puzzle, the worse it is. Now, would you do that with that decision? That's up, or with that information, that's up to you, right? So for me, for example, if they were to tell me that I could not build my house because in order to do so, I would have to cut down 5 sycamore trees. Well, there's sycamore trees all over the place. So for me, I would say, well, it's worth it to cut down those 5 sycamore trees. And then don't get me wrong, like I just said, every single individual too is a piece of it. So yes, cutting down those 5 particular sycamore trees will lower the genetic diversity of the local sycamores. But, in my case, I would choose to do it because I need to build a house, right? So anyway, big picture stuff out of the way. Let's talk about probably what you want to hear. which is grades. So I'll remind you guys, for grades, just meet me. Find a time to meet me online and let me give you specific, detailed feedback about your assignment. We could talk about what you did right, what you did wrong, and at the very least, you'll get a 5% boost to the grade for that assignment. Possibly a 10% boost if I find that our conversation is particularly useful for the rest of the class, and if you let me record it and share it, then yeah, you could possibly get up to a 10% boost. So yeah, come to me for feedback. Regarding general feedback, for last week's discussion, we saw the same mistakes as I saw. Well, first of all, the same mistakes that we see all semester, which is things like not following the prompts carefully, not using a reference, and of course, sometimes not using reference, but not using it properly. So I saw a lot of that. And then the other mistakes I saw a lot of last week were the same as the week prior, where I kind of, and you can watch that last video if you want, but I kind of described it as the 3-2-1 rule or method, meaning, when we talked about biodiversity, one of the things you needed to do in your letter was, at the very least, define biodiversity, right? So if you didn't do even that, you lost 3 points. Now, if you just defined it and didn't say anything else about it, then you lost 2 points. If you defined it and at least put one sentence about why it's important, then you lost 1 point. If you defined it and then really went on and talked about why it's important, then you didn't lose any points, okay? Because the purpose here, again, is you're writing to an elected official. And if you really want something done, you know that you would actually write about it. You would try to sell them, right? You wouldn't just do one sentence as if this was an assignment at a 100 level course to get your college diploma. So anyway, or your college degree. So yeah, that's the main issues I saw with the discussions last week. Let me think about the lab. The lab is pretty straightforward. Just some people, I think, misread questions. And it's a good time to remind you too, if I remember correctly, very few people, after misreading the questions and me returning their grade, very few people are fixing their mistakes. Remember, you can fix your mistakes for full credit as long as it's done before the due date. And even now, you can go back and fix your mistakes from last week and from week 3 and week 2 and week 1. You can still do that. It'll be partial credit, so your grade will only improve a little bit, but it's still an improvement. So you should really consider that. Another thing, sorry, I'm bouncing back and forth. I should have written this down. Another thing about the discussions is every week there's an extra credit section. You can go in there and just do extra credit. And I'm starting to branch out. So it's more things that you could write about for the extra credit. In my opinion, it's pretty simple stuff. So please look into that. And again, you can go back to week 4, week 3, week 2, week 1. You can, even though we passed those discussions, you can still go back to those discussions and participate in those extra credit opportunities, those extra credit discussions. Yeah. And then the last thing was the exam. Some people seem pretty confused about the directions. Maybe I should make it more obvious. I don't know. But when you go to take the exam, right there at the beginning, that page, before you click it to start it, it says, once you go forward, you can't go back. And I had to do that on purpose because some of the questions give away some of the answers. I'll give you one more quick example. There's one student who started the exam and then had like sort of an emergency and had to back out and couldn't finish it. But because of the logs, and I could see when they logged in and what they only saw the first 5 questions. So I am now able to let that student retake the exam except for those first 5 questions because they've already seen them, right? So that saved it. Had it been the situation where you could see the whole exam, then that student might be a little bit out of luck because I can't let them, retake the exam when I know that they've seen the whole thing, possibly even taken pictures of it with their phone, and then studied it and then, go back to take it later, right? So I know that whole not being able to go back is a bad thing in some situations, but it is what it is, and the directions were there. All this to say, I'm fine with letting you guys retake the second exam, just like I am the first. Some of you still haven't even done the first one. So to remind you, it'll be a partial increase in the grade. So for example, for the first exam, if you had a 50 and then you retook it and got a 100, then we would average it out and you would get a 75. And it's going to be the same situation for exam 2, except this time because you have a little bit more experience now with my exams. So I'm going to be a little bit less lenient. You'll still get an increase, but this time your original grade is going to count twice and your second grade will count once. So for example, again, if you got a 50 and then you got a 100. So that would be 50 plus 50 plus 100. So that's a total of 200. Divide that by 3 to get the average. So your grade would go from a 50 to a 66.67. And that's just an example. But it's still an increase. And also remind you, like I did on this last video, or the last video where we discussed an exam, for the retake, it's not timed, and it's open book. You can use your book, you can use your notes, you can use the internet. The only thing I don't want you to do is copying off someone else's exam. And that's it. So there's no reason not to retake the exam. And then finally, if your grade is lower for some reason, if somehow when you retake the exam, when it's not timed and it's open book, if you could somehow manage to get a lower grade, it won't hurt you. We'll just keep your original higher grade. So that's it. I hope you guys have a good week. Please let me know if you need any help or if you need any feedback. I know most online courses are kind of like you do things on your own. And I'm fine with letting you do things on your own, but I also want you to know that I'm here if you need me. This doesn't have to be like a typical online class. I will meet you and walk you through the discussions, walk you through the exams. I can't do that. Walk you through the labs, things like that. So again, have a great week. Thank you for your time. Oh yeah, if you watch this video, send me an email. I don't know, list at least 3 topics that I discussed with enough detail to prove that you watched it. And I'll give you, I don't know, 2 points of extra credit. I know it's not much, but you should be watching these things anyway. So I'm just rewarding you for doing something that you should be doing.